Teachers of Reddit, what was the best excuse for being late that turned out to be true? I apologize that I'm writing this on mobile, so there might be errors. I'm an English professor, and one year a pretty good student showed up without one of his 2 major term papers. He explained that his safe had been stolen by a contractor who was working on their house. His laptop was in the safe, and that's where his paper was. I genuinely believe him, because he'd been a really good student. Then over the next few weeks, he started to show up to class looking very tired. He said that he was on a hunt for the person who stole his safe, and he was spending late nights with his cousin driving around looking for the guy, because they knew his van. Now, the student and his cousin were both recently back from tours in Iraq, and had seen combat experience. They wanted to find the guy, to beat the shit out of him, and get the safe back, because his wife's wedding ring was in the safe as well as a bunch of cash. He rewrote the paper, and turned it in, apologetic that it wasn't up to his usual quality, but he still kept coming to class looking like he hadn't slept. After a little while he came very happy to my office hours, and he reported that he found the guy after a long search that involved breaking into a meth den, shaking people down with baseball bats, and even bribing some prostitutes. He said that they found the guy's van at a Taco Bell after getting a tip from a prostitute, and they cornered him and waited for the police to come. I read in the news that he had in fact done a citizen's arrest and stopped the guy at a Taco Bell, and that they ended up calling in the Secret Service because he used the cash that he stole from the safe to buy a bunch of counterfeiting equipment. Secret Service apparently investigates counterfeiting, so the whole investigation happened because this guy, who I dubbed the White Shaft, tracked the scumbag down through the bad side of town late at night to get a wedding ring, some cash, and his research paper back. It all turned out to be true. He got the ring and the laptop back. I gladly accepted his original paper, and it got a much higher grade than the rewrite. Edit. Thank you, kind strangers, for the rewards and upvotes. I'm pretty blown away by the response. I'm trying to read all the comments, but it's making me a bad teacher. I don't want to have my head stuck on my phone during class and miss the student who might generate the sequel. Edit 2. A couple people asked for more details, so here are a few more. I can't recall the year this happened, but it was the height of the war with the US and Iraq. My student had enrolled in the army right after 9/11 on the same day as his cousin. They were both just out of high school and enrolled due to patriotism and frustration. According to him, when he started his vigilante spree, he actually went inside of a house used by meth addicts to try and find the guy. They shook the house down with baseball bats and forced everyone out into the street. When the cops showed up, they told my student how dangerous this was and not to do it again. Then, they gave him their cards and said, "But call us if you do." They shook down at least 2 other drug dens, and the same cop was waiting outside both times to arrest people, since he didn't need to get a search warrant as everyone was outside now at the point of 2 baseball bats. I told my student how dangerous this all was, and he was very John Wick about getting his wife's wedding ring back. Also, I tried to find a link to the story, but it was a small story, and the Googles aren't being very helpful, especially since I can't remember the year. Again, thanks for the love and the gold, kind ones. Story time. I was the only high schooler on our school bus one winter. The other detail important to this story is that we had the oldest model bus that wasn't in the best mechanical shape. It had one of those mechanically operated doors. It would shoot out a plume of black smoke every time it started, and just looked much less fancy than all the other buses the school had. Anyway, one winter it was so cold that the diesel engine stopped working. The bus driver said the cold made the diesel in the fuel lines gel up. I have no idea if that's accurate, but either way the bus wouldn't start. Fortunately, we were only 5 miles from the school and all the kids had been picked up already. So they just radioed another, newer bus to loop back around and pick us up. The bus driver had radioed the elementary school, but completely forgot to let the high school know. So I show up to class and the teacher asks why I was late. I said, the cold caused the fuel lines to gel up in the school bus, repeating exactly what the bus driver told us. But I was the only high schooler on that bus, so no other students were there to back up my story. The teacher didn't believe me, and instead of just calling the main office, To verify my story, she mocked me in front of the whole class, saying it's not possible for fuel to freeze in the cold. And everyone in the class agreed with her, saying that I was a bad liar, and laughed at how dumb my story was. Ultimately, the office did let her know about the bus after she tried giving me a detention, but the embarrassment is still there, and she never gave me an apology. One of my friends was training for cross country on a weekend once, and she was hit by a pickup truck that ran a stop sign. She flew over the top of it and broke both of her kneecaps. The pickup truck drove off. She said she can't remember any of the events that happened immediately afterwards, but the police report said that a bystander pulled over to help, and when they asked if she was alright, she just kept repeating a bunch of letters and numbers over and over, not even saying anything else except JHP 887, JHP 887, JHP 887, JHP 887. Just constantly saying it, like she was in some manic state. Eventually, after the police had already been called, the dude who pulled over to help realized that those were the license plate numbers and wrote them down. There was no security footage of it, and her being able to glance at the plates was the only reason they were able to track down the truck that hit her. To this day, that is the single most badass thing she's ever done. I can't imagine flying over the top of a truck and having enough mental capacity in that moment to look at the license plate and memorize it while having two knees that don't have functioning kneecaps. Edit. I wish there was a silver lining in this story, but she had to have tons of surgery and to this day has some bad knees and can't really run like she used to. Not to mention the guy they tracked down didn't have any insurance and was just an elderly man who had pretty severe of dementia and panicked after hitting her, so they didn't even press charges. I've told this story before. Obligatory, not a teacher, but a student. I was constantly late to a class my senior year of high school. I had depression and was on a 504 plan as a result. For this reason, I was allowed some extra time in the hallways before class to recover from the mental stress of being in a class, etc. It was super helpful, and yes, a pretty weird 504 plan. One time I was running late and witnessed a car hit a pedestrian crossing the road, severely injuring him, and the car drove away. My brother, who was into cars, recognized the car and identified it to me as our neighbor who was also in my first period. I stopped to help the pedestrian, also a student at the school, because I had some first aid / lifeguard training. I called him an ambulance and waited for it to show up. I also called the school and told them that he would be going to the hospital. Yep, pretty nice of me. When I got to school, my brother and I went down to the front office to get a note for tardiness. The admin I called was waiting there. He thanked me, gave me a note, and told me to tell the teacher if there were any questions to call him. My brother told him about the car that he had recognized and that we knew the driver and who that person was. We both went to our classes. I got to first period late again, and my teacher didn't even want to hear my excuse. I pressed the note into her hand and told her the story anyway. The driver of the car was sitting in the back of the classroom with a guilty look on her face. She looked scared shitless. When my teacher wouldn't stop giving me shit for my lie, I gave up and waited for justice to take its course. For the record, I never lied. When I came to class late, I always told the truth. I slept late. I never invoked my 504 plan for that particular class, even though my teacher knew about it and would be forced to accept it. Halfway through class, the administrator entered with the school resource officer and informed my teacher that the student needed to come with him right now for a hit and run. He saw that I was sitting there and thanked me again for my help and for putting another person's needs above my own. Man, it was nice to help that kid, but it was really nice to see my teacher's face go from disgusted at the driver to shocked and disgusted when she realized my story was true. Not a teacher, but my senior year of high school. They were doing construction on the building, and so part of it was completely closed. To make up for the lack of space, there was a vocational school nearby in the district that let us use the extra rooms they did not use. To get to the other school, you could get on a bus, or if your last class of the day was at the vocational school, you could drive over there. I was driving a friend and myself over to the same English class. Traffic gets pretty stop and go at this time as there's a lot of buses and students all going to the same place. The kid behind me wasn't paying attention during one of the stop moments and rear-ended me. Now it was stop and go traffic, so it wasn't like any of us were going fast. It was really just a bump. Still everyone got out to see damage and make sure everyone was okay. We were all fine. We both had piece of crap cars. We both decided that nothing was significant. May as well get back into the line of traffic and get to class. Bonus, the kid who hit me was also in that same English class. My friend and I walk into class late first. The teacher was known for being a stickler. Very snidely says, "You two better have a good reason for being tardy." My friend laughs and I respond, "Yeah, other classmate just rear-ended us on the way here. You can confirm with him when he gets here." So a minute later he rushes in saying, "Sorry I'm tardy, I hit schoolie and friend." Rest of class laughs. Stern teacher makes us all get down to business. The end. I teach a college freshman paper writing class. Over the course of the semester, we have 2 workshop sessions where students bring in their drafts and critique each other's drafts. Each one counts for 5% of the grade, and missing it unexcused means forfeiting that 5%. An excused absence makes the other workshop session worth 10% of the grade point anyway. During the first workshop session, there was a student who I did not expect to be absent at all, but 60 minutes into the class, hadn't shown up. Class is 90 minutes long. Normally, I wouldn't allow someone to come in that late, especially to a workshop session. However, he had the best excuse. He gives me this letter from a doctor at the ped department. Turns out he had judo for ped that morning. He was paired up with a more experienced sparring partner who flipped him upside down. He landed on his head, I think. Under symptoms, the note read that he had temporary memory loss and a possible concussion. Under recommendations, it said that he should go home. I asked him if why he didn't go home. He said that he didn't want to deal with the complications of missing workshop. I should note that my class was on the 5th floor of a building with no elevator and high ceilings, so he had already gone up 4 flights of stairs. I didn't want to waste his efforts, so I let him push through. He mentioned that he couldn't remember where he put his pen, needed to write comments on classmates' drafts, so I barked at one of his poor classmates to lend him 1 point afterwards. I went to our faculty room and told them about it. They all called BS. And then I showed them the note, which completely changed their tone. Started accusing me of creating a pressuring classroom environment. Half joking, I think. TLDR, student shows up to class with head injury with a note to prove it. Chooses not to go home because he doesn't want to miss the activity for that day. Edit. Just want to clarify the timeline because I realize it might have caused some concern. The judo incident happened in the morning, around 9 or 10 am. My class was from 4-5:30, with the student arriving 5ish. In the time between the incident and the student arriving late to my class, he was able to rest, regained his memories, although possibly not totally since, again, he couldn't find his pen, was cleared from having a concussion by a doctor. The doctor wrote the note to explain why he would miss classes, because the recommendation was that he go straight home, which would mean taking public transport for about an hour. However, the student decided he might as well attend what's left of the class. He was still wearing the judo pants. He did a good job critiquing his classmates' works, by the way. Not a teacher, but when I was in elementary school, I remember an incident where I had a homework sheet I'd taken home to complete. I can't remember what the subject was. I do remember I spent most of my evening after dinner sitting at the table with my dad trying to complete it. This was torture. For some reason my dad and I never connected in a learning environment. He would dictate things to me and expect me to get it, but he really struggled to walk me through the process needed for me to understand it. So after many hours of yelling and arguing and tears and being absolutely miserable, I finished the damn worksheet, set it down, and went to bed. In the morning I woke up to discover a critical error with my homework. When I set it down to get ready for bed, I had set it on top of the birdcage instead of on top of the shelf next to it. I don't know why I thought to do this instead of putting it on the shelf. I can only assume I thought flat surface good in my poor tired brain. My cockatoo eel was greatly offended by this mysterious new object on top of its home, and had spent most of the night shredding my worksheets to pieces. I took the remains with me to school, and when they asked us to hand in our assignments, I kinda just looked at my teacher with a completely defeated expression on my face, and uttered the words my bird ate my homework. The uproar of laughter from the class was deafening. My teacher took the sheet from me and examined it carefully, then sighed as he tells me, well, it looks like you tore this page apart with a hole punch. Come see me after class. I didn't expect to be accused of lying, so in my shock I started arguing with him. No, really, my bird ate my homework. Which only spurred the laughter from the class further. I didn't know what else to do. Did you ever get that frog in your throat feeling as kid, where your voice just seizes up, and you can't manage to squeak out any sound, no matter how much you might try? 4 years afterwards I'd get bullies making stupid "did your bird eat your homework again" jokes from kids that had been in that class. Adult me thinks it's kinda funny. I'd probably laugh too, if it wasn't me. I had pushed myself, been pushed by my dad, so hard just to complete that damn assignment, only to have it ruined, be accused of lying, and be embarrassed and teased for the situation. Poor 7-year-old Lanko just wasn't prepared for life yet, you know? I was the student. My senior year in high school, I was dual enrolled at the local college taking some night classes, so I only had 2 classes at the high school that year. Unfortunately, the way the schedule worked, I had to go to first period and last period, with the middle of the day off. Usually I'd drive to the nearby wilderness area and go hiking by a river. On this particular day, there was an old van in the parking area at the trailhead. I parked right next to it and got out of my car. As I walked past the van, I noticed there was a man inside. We made eye contact and I smiled and waved, but then noticed that dude was fully naked and jerking off. I freaked out, but instead of getting back in my car and peeling out like a not panicking person might do, I ran away from the parking area, straight through the river, about 2 to 3 feet deep, 20 feet across, and crouched in the bushes, where I could see the parking lot. I was sure this guy was gonna chase after me, rap and murder me, and no one would know, because it was 1 PM on a Tuesday in the goddamn wilderness. When he didn't chase after me, I was still terrified he'd be waiting at my car for me, so I wasn't going back until either I saw him leave, or another car pulled up. It was 2000, so I didn't have a cell phone, and I waited over an hour for another car to show up. When it did, I emerged, ran back through the river, crawled into my car from the passenger's side, because the driver's side was next to the van, and sped the fuck away. I was 20 minutes late getting to my Spanish class, but I thought my teacher would understand given that I was still soaking wet up to my waist and clearly some shit had gone down. But she wouldn't let me join the class until I'd explained my tardiness in Spanish. Sorry, profesora, but you never taught us the Spanish word for master, bait. But I do think I was able to communicate my experience, because she didn't punish me. In retrospect, I'm sure that guy was just enjoying a scenic wank at a time and place where he had a reasonable expectation of being alone. Definitely still creepy, but if he had been looking for teenagers to assault that day, the middle of nowhere during school hours probably wasn't the place to look. Not a teacher, but I was the student. So I grew up on Martha's Vineyard Island off the coast of Massachusetts, but I went to a private school on Cape Cod, mainland Massachusetts, for high school. This meant that myself and about 20 other students took a boat to school every day, and if the weather is bad, then the boats don't run, and we either get a later boat or we just don't go to school, because we can't point once we make port on the Cape. There's a bus that picks us up to take us the rest of the way to school. One time, as we were standing at the boat terminal, we watched the bus waiting in line behind the other vehicles looking to get in line for the boat, or go to the pickup/drop-off area. Everyone has to check in at this booth, so that the dock workers can make sure each vehicle goes where they need to be, and to ensure what I'm about to tell you doesn't happen, and our bus was behind a 16-wheeler truck looking to bring cargo over on the boat. The truck drove past the booth by a little bit, but rather than wait for the booth attendant to walk to him, the driver began to back up to the booth. Now anyone who has ever been in traffic or a line of vehicles can tell you that backing up is the worst thing you can do, because the person behind you has nowhere to go. so the truck backed into the front of our bus, and we had to wait for a different bus to pick us up. My buddy and I walked into our English class with 10 minutes left, and the new teacher gave us a ton of shit for missing the lesson. We wouldn't have cared if it weren't for the fact that we had been around 5 minutes late for every lesson due to us needing to take a boat and then a bus to get to school, and she gave us shit for every time we were late. The school administration knew about our unique situation and gave all the Martha's Vineyard students a pass to be late. So after getting shit for this particular instance, we didn't bother explaining it to her again. We just walked down to the front office, went straight to the headmaster, and complained about how this teacher just refused to give us a break for circumstances we can't control. That was the last we ever had to deal with her giving us crap for being late. Not a teacher, but as a student. It's a long one, 9/11. I live in Canada, and was home alone the morning before leaving for high school. The courses started pretty late, like at 9:30 am, and I was living near the school, maybe 15 minutes walk. The TV was on a news channel, and I was preparing my stuff to go to school when they started showing the first images of the first plane crash in the WTC. At first, I thought it was a major plane accident, but nothing else, so I resumed what I was doing after a few minutes. Then the second plane came, and everybody knows the rest. I watched the news feed for a while and they started talking about evacuations of some building downtown etc. So at this point I decide that I need to go to school cause I'm already very late and I don't know what will happen. Even the news looked panicked. When I arrive at school, courses are already started, so I need to go to the principal to get a paper that allow me to get to class. I was already known to be often late, but since I walked to school every day, I always managed to get a good excuse and get away with it. So I get to the principal office and tell him why I'm late. For me it's pretty obvious and a quite reasonable reason, but he's clearly not aware at all of the attacks at this time. That morning he decided he had enough of my excuses, doesn't believe anything I'm saying, and start yelling at me and menacing me to put me in detention, etc. I finally convinced him to open the radio he had in his office to listen to the news by telling him that if I'm lying he could put me in detention for a month if he wanted. At this point, the first tower was down, so every radio channel was on a special alert program talking only about this. He immediately grabbed his phone and signed me the late paper telling me to go to my class. I went to class, and like 15 minutes later they cancelled the courses and gathered everybody in the gym to tell us about what was happening. He apologized to me in front of the whole school. At this point, we were pretty panicked, so I didn't think much of it at the time, but thinking of it now, it was kind of nice of him. I continued to be frequented late to school after that, but he always signed my paper saying nothing after that without even asking for a reason. I was late for school because when I walked past my neighbor's house her car was running, but she had run into her fence. A small part of the fence was downed. It seemed she spilled yogurt all over and maybe lost control trying to clean it up. My mom always ate breakfast in the car on the way to work. I felt bad for her. The mess on the dash and window and the little white picket fence she had built with her husband. She had obviously backed out of their driveway, but when the car was put in drive, she messed up and hit the fence, spilling her yogurt. So, I put down my books and went over to help her clean up. When I got to her car I realized her head was blown up. I ran home to my mom who called the cops. When I finally got to school, about 2 hours late, they wanted to know why I was late. I found my neighbor with her head blown off. No one seemed to believe me and called my mom to inform her I was late and truant. It was resolved rather quickly since my mom was still talking to detectives and they explained to my principal. Turned out the yogurt was brains and blood spatter. Her husband was eventually arrested for murder and insurance fraud. He was an engineer that rigged the car to fire a hidden shotgun when the car was put into drive. P.S. Both Peggy, victim, and my mom were teachers at the time. College graduate here, not really the topic, but it goes hand in hand. There was a student, older, who was pregnant. She was in the graduate program. She had complications and went into preterm labor about a month early, so the baby had to be in the NICU. Well, she obviously messaged the prof, because as luck would have it, this happened the week of the final. She asked if she could take the exam either from the hospital or online and the prof said no, she would just fail her. After sending over doctor's notes, medical proof, anything she could to prove she was in this situation, the prof still said no, that she would fail. The TARS looked at her grades, she should have passed without the final. But the prof was threatening to fail her in the whole class on the principle of her not showing up, rather than giving her an F on the exam itself. Needless to say, the TARS and other students complained to the dean and advisors. She never got in trouble. Ever since then the entire student population in that major have been trying to get her fired. This was one of the worst moral judgment calls she made, but she has done similar things to students, including targeting men to fail, because she hates men. She's very open about this fact, but gotta love that tenure. I witnessed her calling the campus police on a male student for simply getting up and throwing away a wrapper before class even started, claiming he was being disrespectful. Anyway, this woman needs to be fired. I get having a no excuses policy, but to what end? This woman was in the hospital post C-section with a baby in an incubator and you couldn't email the exam over to her? Sigh. It still hurts my heart for that woman. Not sure if this counts. I was the student. During the beginning of a reading class, I was excused to go to the library to get a new book. On the way to the library, I saw two teachers whispering to each other in the hall. On the way back, I was stopped by one, taken to the office, and made to stay in there for 2 hours until my very pissed mom came to pick me up and essentially tell the office administrators to fuck off. My crime? I had a 1-inch hole in my jeans that was just above my knee. Turns out the male gym teacher felt my outfit was inappropriate and told the special ed teacher to grab me on my way back from the library and take me to the office. I was sobbing because I didn't have access to any other jeans that fit. I'm a weird size. My options were to call my mom and have her bring me new jeans or cover my pants up with fluorescent duct tape. I knew all the other kids would make fun of me and the tape would ruin these jeans anyway. So they made me sit in the office with them, sobbing, for 2 hours until my mom came in. She told them that they are insane. She approved the outfit, and I was already such a modest girl that this was the best that we could find. She told me we are gonna go home and get some ice cream. Fun fact, the office never told my teacher they took me. Imagine her confusion and surprise when 2 hours after I went missing, I came back to grab my stuff. Yup, sorry Mrs. Morrison. The office felt it was more important to keep my inappropriate jeans in the office than to allow you to know where I'm without abandoning your class. Not a teacher, but several from when I was a student. Elementary school. My mom was a labor delivery nurse. If she was called in early, she's dropped me at my grandparents and my grandma would take me to school on her way to work. On more than one occasion, she kept going past the school and forgot to drop me off. As a child with severe selective mutism, she wouldn't realize it until she was almost to work or at work. The school got used to it. Middle school is walk to school, but there was a railroad track I had to cross. Every few weeks, the conductor would stop the trains on the tracks and go to the biscuit shop next to the tracks to get breakfast biscuits. I'd have to go to the biscuit shop and get him so he could witness me safely climbing between train cars to get across high school. Before I had a car and license, my mom had transitioned to home health care. Because we lived out in the boonies, I'd sometimes have to go on an early morning call with her before she dropped me off at school when my dad was on a contract out of state. She loved chatting with her patients, even when the clock was ticking. It wasn't unusual for me to roll in almost 2 hours late because she couldn't stop talking. Don't get me wrong. She loved her patients, they loved her, and she was an excellent nurse, but I needed to get to school. When I was 12 I had to walk to class and cross through one of the 2-lane roads. People don't usually stop at the crosswalk, so when someone does you have to be fast. Anyway, I get to this point and the car closest to me slows down. I start crossing, and the car A in the 2nd lane stops. Car B right behind it slows down, but car C faking speeds up, smashes into B who smashes into A who smashes into me. I had a big exam that morning and I really did not want to be late, so I stood up, dusted off my uniform, and started running to school. I make it there, just as the automatic doors are closing for the how, slip through and keep running towards class. When I get there, 5 minutes late, the teacher, a big guy who really didn't like me cause I spoke better English than him, I'm French, starts screaming at me saying that I will not be taking the exam and that I wouldn't pass anyway. Because it was an exam, there was a second teacher there, and she saw that I had blood running down my arm, dust in my hair, and that my clothes were torn. She brought me to the nurse and I went to the hospital. 2 days later, the school calls my mom to say that I have to take the exam that same day. The first teacher was there, and seething he said he hoped it had been worse for me, and that I should have been injured. That would have been better. Still don't know why he hates me so much. I'm a teacher, but this happened when I was in 5th grade. So I was on my school bus and the place where I lived was the second stop of the morning. There were about 10ish of us who got on. Because of being an early stop and one of the oldest kids on the bus, I had a seat right up front, so I could set a good example for the littles. Anyways, it was a cold winter morning with some snow, but not enough to get school cancelled. The bus went through the normal routine until we went down this one road. It was a fairly narrow dirt road that honestly looked more like a country back road than something in a small city. Anyways, this road was basically shaped like this: vertical bar, vertical bar, vertical bar, L underscore followed by another L underscore stretch point. Basically, there were 2 narrow turns. On the first turn, the bus got stuck in snow that the wind had piled up. So a bus full of kindergarten to 5th graders stuck in the snow. We were there for a couple of hours, not an exaggeration. The bus driver was calling for help, and after about 2 hours, the school district sent a tow truck to pull us out. It worked and the tow truck left, because clearly it wasn't needed. Except then about 5 minutes later, we get to the second turn, and get stuck again. At that point, the school district said screw this, and sent the tow truck and a second bus over. All us kids had to walk to the nearest road, where the next bus was located. All the older kids had a group of littles to keep track of, which was super annoying, but was whatever for me, since I was given the kids from my stop and they all knew me / I knew them. Then the second bus took us to the Cater school and we dropped the littles off. By the time we made it to the upper elementary school, 326, we were over 3 hours late. My class was literally getting ready to head out for recess, but I know the couple of us from that bus bugged to stay in because we were already so cold. Our lunch was joined by the 3rd and 4th graders who'd missed their lunch because of the crazy bus situation. Okay, so I'm not a teacher, but I have one really dumb but true excuse I used. I had a very strict geometry teacher for my second period in my sophomore year of high school. He'd lock the door as soon as the last passing bell sounded and only let students in once they had a tardy pass from the front office. He never accepted any excuses. One day I was wearing very cute new yellow flats, but they were giving me blisters. So after first period ended, I left campus to go to my BFF's home to get socks because she lived across the street. I was probably 5 minutes late getting back, and I forgot I needed a tardy pass from the front office, so I just went straight to his class. When he opened the door, he looked very shocked to see me, and instead of asking for a tardy pass, he asked why I was so late. I went to get socks. Socks? Yeah, socks. At which point I wiggles my foot at him, and he stared at my foot then at me, and he opened the door all the way, as if he was so flabbergasted his dismay couldn't be contained in the crack of the door through which he was speaking to me. So I sidled past him into the room to get to my desk, and all the students are just staring at me, and I sit at my desk, and he closes the door. So he walks up to me and asks, why did you need socks? Cause my shoes were giving me blisters. Where did you go to get the socks? Across the street to my friend's home. Security just let you go off campus. They've never stopped me before. Classroom, utter silence. Okay then, he didn't mark me as absent or tardy that day. I don't know why he let me get away with it, because it wasn't a valid reason, just an honest one. Okay, so preface this with the fact that I was a terrible student and quite a snotty little fuck up in high school. I had pretty much blown off algebra for most of the year. Towards the end of the 4th quarter, I, rather ironically, did the math and figured it was impossible for me to get a passing grade point, so my brilliant high school brain figured, why go at all? With that decision made, and 6 weeks left in the school year, I just skipped algebra every day. The problem was, I had another class I liked and was passing, and it was only a few doors down from said algebra class, and between classes, that algebra teacher had a tendency to stand in the hall outside her classroom. This meant I had to go the long way around to get to and from the class I liked. Finally, for weeks into my epic skip, I was slipping my way around to the class I liked when I heard Mr. Boingy. Sure enough, I was caught. I haven't seen you in my class for a while. Oh, yeah. Well, it's not like I can pass, and if I drop the class I can't take it in summer school, so if you're not in my class tomorrow and for the rest of the school year, I'll have you kicked out of the class and you won't be able to take it in summer school anyway. Am I clear? Oh, yeah. Now I hated me some algebra. Pretty obvious by now. 5 weeks of algebra in summer school versus another year was a no-brainer. But I still had to be me, so the next day I barged into the classroom a few minutes after the bell. Every head turned and looked at me, and with a completely straight face I asked, am I late? Thunderous applause and 5 weeks of wasted summer ensued. Not really worth it, but I was 4 weeks and 5 minutes late for class with no punishment, so I guess my excuse was good enough. Open bracket question mark close bracket. As a student, not a teacher, my excuse for being late was I was hit by postal mail. I was running late for the school bus which left from a bus stop across the road and opposite my house. From my bedroom window, which was at the front of the house, I could see the school bus approaching, so I quickly finished packing my school bag. Yep, I was running really late and bolted out front door. We had a zebra crossing outside our house. Near the bus stop, as I ran across it, a post van suddenly came out of nowhere. In hindsight, he came from behind the bus. The driver hadn't previously seen me as I came from our front porch to bolt across the crossing. I was very lucky in that it was a weird van, a bit like those old milk trucks, open on both sides at the front of the van, so the driver could get in and out easily on both sides. So instead of being hit by the van, I started to run through the van via the open doors at the front. The driver then slammed on the brakes and a heavy bag of mail hit me on the head. It fell through the open top part of the inside cage inside the van. The school bus was still parked at the bus stop as I think the driver wanted to see what happened to me. But as I got onto the bus, I explained what happened, and he was worried about concussion, so he called my parents who were still finishing their breakfast inside our house. I was then taken to hospital for a few hours observation. The doctors changed shifts halfway through, and when the new doctor asked what happened, I got hit by mail as I was completely fine, no concussion, and I was still in my school uniform and had my books. When my parents came to collect me from hospital, they dropped me off to school. It says in the school register, was late today, was hit by postal mail. How I survived my childhood, I have no idea, always getting into some mischief. A story from when I was a student, rather than staff. It was lunchtime and a new Irish teacher spotted a junior, 14 years old, walking back onto school grounds from off campus, strictly forbidden for everyone, except last year's and people with exceptional circumstances, and a note provided to the office if it's a regular occasion. He called her out for it and said he wanted a great reason or she'd get detention. She said, I go home at lunch and recess to feed my baby. He looked her up and down with a disbelieving facial expression. She was a slender girl, scoffed and said something along the lines of, now I've heard everything. Nice try. I was in last year and my group were sitting nearby watching this happen. We were all kind of hesitating, wondering if we should go over and say something, explain the situation, before he upset her anymore. But she kind of took a deep breath and we expected her to have a go at him, but she was pretty calm and just said fine, do whatever. He came back with something really ashly, I don't remember exactly, but he gave her lunchtime detention for the rest of the week and said something like, tell your baby you're sorry, but you'll be in detention instead, or might want to feed baby extra breakfast because I'll see you tomorrow at lunch. It was really douchey and stupid, and honestly it was like the teacher thought he was in some kind of comedy movie. I don't remember exactly what he said or how he phrases it, but it was really quite bad, like it was an awkward situation to watch before. But then he made us all really uncomfortable and upset for the girl. The girl said something like, I doubt it, or probably not, as she was walking away, and then of course the teacher assumed she'd given him a fake name / homeroom info. so he demanded she go with him to the staff room, within visible distance of where we were, so he could check. She said no thank you, and kept walking away. I also don't remember if someone in my group went to the staff room to tell someone what was happening, or if one of the teachers we liked just happened to come out and walk towards us / the new teacher, but one of our teachers, who was also the mum of a guy in our group, came over and the mean guy assumed she'd come to chat to him. He was all acting like he's Mr. Comedy movie character, arms crossed casually, leaning back on his heels, half looking at the teacher walking over, and then looking down the hill at the girl, while she was walking away, grossly chuckling to himself, all smug, because he figures this other teacher will be able to tell him who the girl was, and will laugh at his little story, because kids are so dumb, and he's so witty and clever for figuring it out. So our teacher friend stops next to mean teacher and kind of takes in the situation that we are super uncomfortable, some making awkward normal conversation about crap, just to fill the silence and hopefully avoid him talking to us. I don't know what my friends were thinking, but I was kind of stuck trying to work out if I should go ask if she's okay. So the friend teacher has just paused for a mere second to process and probably work out how to ask what happened, and the teacher chuckles and lets out a long "wowie what an interesting and funny day" sigh, and then launches into a weird boastful summary of his wins against the students, and how he's so clever even though he's new, and how funny it is, and he obviously feels like this last one just really emphasizes how witty and intelligent he is, because he paused for dramatic effect, used air quotes, and a bit of a voice and just really went for it. Just caught that girl coming back from down the street without a pass. She said she had to go home and feed her baby. Apostrophe good teacher shut him down fast, in a way that I remember as being really smooth and completely friendly and innocent sounding. Obviously, this was 11 years ago now, not exact phrasing. But good teacher just started gushing on and on something like, oh girl's name, it's so much to deal with at her age, but she seems to be handling it all really well. I'm sure she's absolutely exhausted, but she keeps pushing on. Through the whole pregnancy she was determined not to fall behind, and she's doing really well with her grades. He was still in classes on her due date and barely had any time off after she was born. Her mum got some time off and has the baby during the day while girl is here, but outside school hours she's doing all the baby work by herself. She's worked so hard over the last year. We've really tried to support her plan as much as possible to help her succeed. All of her teachers are so proud of her. I don't remember how he reacted. I think he played along with the teacher and then walked off. We assumed to find girl, but I do remember the girl definitely complained, because my group had to answer questions about it from the principal. I actually became close friends with the baby's aunt, and last I heard the girl is now married with a few more kids and a bachelor of something, and a job / house and stuff. I don't even remember who the nasty teacher was, or if he was at the school for long. I can picture him clearly, but only in that one situation at school. Maybe he was a pet teacher. My wife was having an allergic reaction on a Sunday before her very last nursing final exam. The reaction only kept getting worse, so she decided to take a shower before heading to the hospital. The hot water and air from the shower made her lightheaded, and she slipped and fell in and sprained her knee in the shower. We finally get to the hospital, wheel her in, because now she can't even walk, on a Sunday afternoon. The hospital gave her medicine for her reaction and put her knee in a brace, then kept her overpass. The whole time she was absolutely freaking out about her exam the next day. She told the nurses there was no way in hell she was going to miss it. I think most of them could relate. Well, the next day comes and myself and our 2 kids, who were 8 and 6 at the time, get her to class. I'm carrying her bag, kids carrying nursing stuff, and she's on crutches. We were only a few minutes late to the study session before the final, only because we came right from the hospital. Her face was still a little swollen from the allergic reaction, and she looks like she'd been through absolute hell. I'll never forget the look of her classmates, or her professor, when we walked in the room. They all asked her, "Why didn't you just reschedule?" Her only reply, "Fuck that." Needless to say, she was extremely nervous and had been studying for weeks for this test and just couldn't handle the stress of postponing this test even for a minute point. Well, she passed the exam and has been a labor and delivery nurse for the last 4 years, but still complains about her knee sometimes. TLDR, don't take a hot shower when having an allergic reaction. Was the student. Had an epileptic seizure from about 9 feet up and landed face first into concrete with a sheer fall. Did not know I was injured while after seizing, and rumored called the police, who called an ambulance due to blood and bone, and I was trying to fight off while bordering on unconsciousness in the post-concussed state after the fall. Broke my face, sinuses, and shattered most of my teeth. Next day we had one of the biggest snowstorms in 50 years and got trapped in the hospital for a day. Needed pretty extensive reconstructive surgery immediately because I couldn't eat and breathing was immensely painful from exposed nerves of 12 teeth. All this happened on a Friday. Missed the Tuesday class and went back to school in time for his Thursday class. All procedures were immensely successful, and unless you look really closely at my teeth, you'd never know it happened. Obviously I got no work done in the meantime. English professor marked me absent Tuesday and wouldn't take my assignment due the Tuesday late because he thought me being hospitalized wasn't true. I fell off a ledge while having a seizure and needed a lot of surgery. Didn't do it for him. Called SDS, over 50 student witnesses, and had the police report, and he begrudgingly accepted the assignment but still marked the absence as the one freebie he gave everyone. I was pissed, but he wouldn't budge, and SDS couldn't do anything since it technically had no academic impact. Fact, that guy. Not a teacher, but once I hid at home because I wanted to skip school for the day and basically pretended to leave in the morning. It was a 3-mile walk for me. I hid in my closet, and after my mom left I got out and played Halo most of the day. By about 11:30 I knew my more fun classes were gonna be coming up and I wanted to see my friends. So I left for school figuring showing up late was better than not at all. As I arrive at school, my teacher, arguably the best and coolest teacher I have ever had, asked me why I was late. I told him I wasn't feeling like school today and wanted to relax, so I played Halo at home. I shit you not, he dead-eyed looked at me and asked me if I got past the flood level. I said yes. Then he said, good time spent, those little assholes keep killing me. And he didn't mark me late. Then later that day gave me a paper to give to my other teachers that said he basically conscripted me for help with setting up a play earlier, which gave me a valid reason for being late. He was my drama tech teacher and was literally the most awesome teacher I have ever had. He talked to us like people and everyone basically used his wisdom like he was a therapist. Like if your mom was beating your dad with tire irons you would feel comfortable talking to him about it. I literally once watched him smoke a blunt with a student, telling the student that smoking was bad for him, and never saw that student light up again because his presence and words carried that much weight with us. Edit. It was a cigarette, not a blunt. It's not really us being late to school, more like all the pupils being late to come home. We were on a school trip to an old Roman colony. I'm from Europe and took Latin, so this kind of makes sense for me to do, and we took the bus there. When the day ended we made our way back to the bus. The chauffeur was lying on the ground next to the bus with blood on his head. Our teachers immediately called an ambulance and the man was taken to the hospital. We got to hang out in the Roman village a little longer while we waited for another chauffeur to come and get us, but there was some trouble, so it took quite a long time. As we were all about 14, we all had cell phones and had texted our parents about what had happened. When we had been waiting for a few hours, the same chauffeur turned up and explained what had happened. Apparently the man didn't have a stomach, not sure how that is possible but that's how it was explained to me, and had forgotten to eat all day because he never got hungry, so he fainted and hit his head on the steps of the bus. The bus company had sent another driver to pick us up, but it would take a long time for him to get to us, so the first chauffeur would drive us halfway and then his coworker would take over the wheel. Never felt more unsafe in my life. When we got home, the first thing we did was tell the whole story to our parents and siblings. And they told us they had gotten the text from the school telling them that the bus had broken down and they expect us to be honest and tell them we woke up late instead of making up some excuse about a flat tire. Sorry for spelling/grammar issues. I'm not a native English speaker. First thing in the morning, homeroom/first period combo situation. Someone rocks on in after third bell. I'm the substitute. Dialogue is paraphrased. Student says, I had to help other teacher with her car. Where's your pass? She didn't write one, said. Students did half-day classes. Half-day trade school was the stereotypical bad kid type, and that morning was smeared elbows down with some kind of dirt, which was new. Jeans were dusty/dirty, which wasn't new. Hat not on his head, which I'd never seen before. All that left me wondering, okay, now what? Do I write is it up or just get started? Then the classroom phone rang. It was other teacher. Student saw me pull in and noticed something wrong with my car. My hands were full because I was running late because my car was acting funny, so I didn't write him a pass, but I just got attendance done up here and called you first thing. He did go right to class, didn't he? Sure did. Didn't even go wash up first. What was wrong with your car? The distribution cap looked at student. So what was wrong with her car? I told her the distributor cap was loose. She hits a lot of curbs and stuff though, so it's all fake. I mean, all messed up. Okay. Other teacher, stories match. Thanks for letting me know. I hung up. You gonna fix it for her? Wonder if she'd give me extra credit. Dude, never do something for free that someone will pay you to do. But go wash your hands. You're a mess. Alright everybody, brace yourselves for more Charles Dickens. Not a teacher nor a student, but this happened at my workplace a number of years ago. Our company used an outsourced labor hire company to bring in casual workers. One of their recruits came in one morning, perfectly on time for a 6 AM start, 2:30 PM finish shift. He seemed like a decent worker. Found out he's a backpacker from Scotland who was in Australia for a year on a working holiday. He was going to be spending the next month in Sydney, and he'd left all his belongings at the backpacker hostel in the CBD. My workplace was out in Sydney's outer western suburbs, so it's a pretty long trek to get from the CBD to our location. I dropped him off at the local train station at the end of our shift to help him out, so he didn't waste his money on a bus fare, plus I was heading that way since I had something to do that afternoon. He seemed pretty keen on returning the next day and said he'd enjoyed working with us. The next morning 6 AM rolls round. He is a no-show, so we think that he must not have liked the job as much as he claimed he did, so we continue on with our work. At 12:45 PM, 15 minutes before our lunch break, we see Mr. Backpacker walk into work. My boss, who was discussing with me the jobs needed to be done after lunch, also noticed and literally said, what the fuck is he doing here this late? So we both walked up and boss asks him, where have you been? It turns out Mr. Backpacker took the last train of the evening and fell asleep. He then ended up waking up at the last station, Lithgow, which isn't even in Sydney. He slept on the platform overnight, and since it was winter and he was freezing cold, he slept in part way during the morning, so he missed the first couple of trains back towards Sydney. Needless to say, the boss told him his services were no longer required and sent him on his way, since he'd already contacted the labor hire company to ask for a replacement who arrived within 35 minutes of our starting hour. Boss called at approximate 6 AM. When previous guy didn't arrive, replacement arrived about 6:35 AM to 6:40 AM. Not a teacher, yada yada yada. It was me in middle school, but I would always ride a scooter to and from school. There were 2 instances, but only one was accepted. The first one was that I was going down the hill right behind the school and a car hit me. First of all, I was dramatic and it only really clipped me, but it still sent me flying to the sidewalk and caused some bruising and a mild shoulder injury. This one was ignored, and I was punished for being late. The second time was when I was riding to school and my scooter slipped on a wet leaf outside the elementary school right by the middle school. I was going at least 20 miles per hour and sawed off, landing on my right knee. There were two massive holes in my leg, and in my brand new True Religion jeans, normally $200, but we found them for $20 with the original tags still on. That was the first time I wore those jeans too, so my mom was pissed. Still can't bring it up years later without her getting mildly disgruntled. I walk into school 5 minutes later, not late but close. My friends down in the pit in the commons all freaked out when they saw me, but I didn't get why. Looking down at my leg, explained it all to me instantly. I didn't freak out, but I was also still in shock. The security guard / janitor / detention staff saw me, and he instantly called the VP down, and we dealt with it. I was about 15 minutes late to 8th grade math after that. Needless to say, I didn't get a detention for that 1 point. Still have the scars on my knee. I was the student once. It was my senior year of high school and my sister and I were on the way to school one morning. I noticed something white in the ditch on the side of the road as I drove by. I don't know why, but my brain told me it was weird and that I needed to turn around and check it out. I ignored it as we were already running behind schedule. About 5 minutes later, and I can't get the feeling to go back out of my head. My sister finally got tired of hearing me struggle with myself and said we might as well point, so I took an alternative, but still fast, route back to where I had seen the white thing. I pull up, and there's a tiny Siamese looking kitten curled up, soaking wet, in the ditch on the side of the road. It was late winter / early spring at this point, so it had frosted overnight, and the kitty was very cold. I scooped him up in a towel and had my sister hold him while I raced us to school. Side story, he pupped on her, and we discovered one of his back legs wasn't working. We arrive about 15 minutes late. I couldn't bring the cat into school with me through the main office and I didn't know what else to do, so I frantically knocked on the window of one of my favorite teachers. She also happened to be a huge cat lover. She looks at me, obviously confused, and shakes her head no as to say she's not going to help me sneak in. I just kind of signaled that I needed her to come ASAP and ran away. So, weirdly enough, I just so happened to have a pet carrier in my backseat from helping my grandma take her cat to the vet a day or two before. So I had my sister put this kitten in the pet carrier and bring it to the side door where my teacher meets me. I had to cut her off before she could tell at me and explained how I had found an injured kitten in the side of the road and that she needed to help me hide it somewhere until the end of the day. She ended up hiding the kitty in a spare classroom, falling in love, and keeping him. He ended up being a ragdoll, and with a little therapy, was able to use his back leg again. It's now about 4 years later, and he lives with her parents and loves lounging in their bathroom sink. We have no clue how he ended up alone in a ditch, but I'm glad I followed my gut and turned around. He was definitely worth missing first period. Student. Halloween night a few years ago I was in school. I and my roommate had to go to emerge because they only had a walk-in clinic once a month, so it was impossible to get in. I had dual ear infections that were affecting my hearing and giving me migraine-like pain. I suspect from this kennel dog that smothered me in kisses a week prior. She had strep throat. The next day we had a test worth 20% of our grade. We got there at 10 AM in the morning, and while we were there car accident victims were rushed in on stretchers. We never got the full story, but aside from some broken bones they were okay, and the driver was charged with drunk driving, but it caused delays in everything, so we didn't walk out of the hospital until 1 AM. So I stayed awake to see our study, but must have fallen asleep at some point. I woke up 5-ish minutes before the exam, threw on what I thought was an easy-on dress, but turned out to be a nightgown. My coat and winter boots, ran into the -40 winter day and all the way to the test, burst through the door huffing and puffing just after the test had been started, and my prof told me to lay AE. So I shoved my wrist with my hospital band still on, got out hospital, gasp for breath, just got breathe, oh god, and she was whatever, here's her test, go sit down. So I sat down only to realize I wasn't wearing any underwear. My dress was a nightgown, my really ugly grandma-like one, and I had not brought a pencil. I got a 32% on that test, should have just tried to get a DR's note. I wasn't a teacher at the time, but a student. We live in a small rural village split in half by a river with the same name as the place, spelt differently for some reason. Over the river there was a bridge. A few meters upstream was the old bridge that didn't connect anything anymore. Anyway, one year we had a lot of rain and floods in the area. No big deal, we lived just far enough from the river to be able to admire the water, but not risk the house and restaurant. My brother and I arrived at school one rainy morning and we started realizing friends weren't there. Some teachers were absent. Eventually bell rang and we headed to class, and it was then that everyone realized about half the student body and teachers didn't make it to school. Turns out the bridge collapsed halfway, the old bridge somewhat shielding most of the new bridge from the worst damage. We are the last property owners on the village side of the bridge, and we didn't even know. The next few days my parents would load some produce and go and sell stuff at the bridge. The kids on the other side would drive to the bridge, climb over the makeshift walkway over the gaping hole and rushing water, get on the school's old bus called the Ark, and then make their way the rest of the 5-minute drive to school. That or make a detour of about an hour. The teachers just didn't penalize kids for being late that year. When I was in med school, histology lectures were in an auditorium on the 3rd floor, European floors, so ground level, then 1st floor, 2nd. The professor was a right TW, and if one would be just 1 minute after him in the room, even if it was early, they would be marked as not attending for the whole class, and you weren't allowed to miss more than one, for stupid organizational reasons, as histology was part of another set of classes with weird attendance rules. But this professor was so into the power trip he didn't mind. So, this girl didn't come one day. Professor was furious. A few minutes into the lecture she called, saying her lung collapsed on the way to the campus. He blew up on her saying he doesn't believe her excuses, and that she will fail the whole year if it happens again. It's not like you fail the whole year, but to attend the exam at the end you need to have all the courses from that year done, and they are only held once a year. So one missed/failed course means a year of waiting, as you are not allowed to attend more advanced ones. So the next day she was a few minutes late, as were 3 guys, who carried her wheelchair, and the drain bottles attached to the tubes inserted in her chest cavity up the stairs, because the elevator needs a key card reserved for teaching staff and maintenance. He still tried to fail her and the dudes who helped her, but after quite a number of people loudly asked if someone has shat in his brains, common insult here, and called the head of the anatomy department, he had to retreat. Many years ago, my car was a MK1 Fiesta, one of my first cars. I was in that clan of 6th formers who drove to school, though my car was nowhere as snazzy as the nearly new Ford Ka and Citroen Saxis my counterparts drove. But I didn't have parents' money to buy cars with. This was bought using cash, working retail jobs. It was the kind of car where you could get out, click the doorknob down, close it, and hey presto, it was locked. So one day, did exactly that. I walked all the way into school, heading for registration, and for whatever reason couldn't feel my car keys in my pocket. I realized what I did and headed back to the car. And yep, there they were sitting in the ignition of my now locked car. A mate of mine showed up right around then and noticed me waiting there trying to get hold of my dad or someone. He asked what was up, and after showing him, he just said, "Cool, wait right there." He got his cell phone out, made a call, and chatted for a minute. About then, a little first year comes running up to him, all smiles. He said, "What you need?" And my friend points out the keys, locked in my car. "No problem," he says. This little first year guy, no more than 13 years old, puts his backpack down, reaches inside and brings out a coat hanger and a metal rod. He slips the rod down inside the door, coat hanger next, 15 seconds maximum, and pops open the lock. He opens the door, proud as punch, like he'd just performed the greatest trick on earth. And he had. He then says, "Want me to start it?" Pointed out the keys were in the ignition and a little disappointed, he says, "No problem, anytime." He packed his bits back in and ran off back towards the school. I've never been more surprised, but hey, saved me a bill for a new window. I had to explain to my girlfriend at the time, when we were watching The Wire, why I was pointing and making loud noises at the TV during that scene, where a student does a similar thing with a teacher's car. Someone explained to our class head who does registration that I was outside waiting for a first year to open my car. She later asked me if I had sorted my car out. I don't think she believed the part that I was rescued by a 13-year-old would-be car thief. I just said I called green flag as an odd excerpt. However he did it. He managed to fix the annoying door rattle in the process. I don't understand teachers that are assholes about being late. When I taught I didn't care at all why you were late. I was just happy you showed up at all. That said, I have had some students with some horrifying stories who still showed up for class. Most often death of family member, bad auto accidents, hit by car, happens more than you think, crashed bike badly, etc. I'd usually just size up the situation outside of the classroom for a second. Tell them that they can go home if they want. Dorms were literally a couple hundred yards down the street. Tell them to get medical attention if they needed it, and tell them not to worry about missing class because they can just make it up at some later date. It was a college class. There were a lot of repeating class times. Edit, or I'd gladly offer to just send them the information they needed, of course. Each situation was different. If the student still showed up after an ordeal like that, they most likely wanted to come to class, so they'd most often come to a makeup class. I understand teachers being pissy about grading late assignments. It's more of an annoyance than most of you realize, but still, that doesn't justify being an asshole. When you're grading, you get into a groove. You know all of the answers, you know all of the common mistakes on the math, and most importantly, you know how much partial credit to give for certain mistakes. So grading goes by quickly. But when you have to go back and regrade the same assignment at a later date, you constantly have to ask yourself, well, how did I grade this for everybody else? I have to grade it the same way to be fair. So it often ends up taking 10x longer to regrade an old assignment than to grade one that was turned in at the correct time. Again, no justification for being an asshole, but still, it is quite annoying when the reason for it being late is 100% bullcrap. To be fair, it's still annoying as hell when the reason isn't bullcrap, but that's part of being a teacher. Obligatory, not a teacher, but when I was in high school, I was severely depressed and had bad anxiety about leaving my house. Thus, nearly every morning I was within minutes of being late, despite living less than 10 blocks from my school. I live in a very small town and was well acquainted with the staff of my high school, so it wasn't a huge issue. My basic morning consisted of waking up, getting dressed, letting my dog out into the yard, eating, and getting my dog back in the house. Well, my dog is a big stubborn Goldie Chow mix, and most days she would come in the house just fine. Except for that day, I was already running 2 to 3 minutes late and tried everything in my power to get her in the house. Eventually, I sat down in the living room to wait it out. 15 minutes after school started, the principal's assistant called my mom, who called me. She told me to get to school, no matter what point. Okay. Understood. No matter what point. So, I grabbed my dog's leash, my backpack, and an old blanket she liked to lay on, and walked her to school. She was thrilled to get a morning walk, and I was happy to take her. When I arrived, I showed up to the classroom with my dog in tow. My teacher raised an eyebrow at me, but I simply walked in and took my seat with my dog. I went through the next 2 classes with everyone just accepting that my dog was here to stay until one of the more strict teachers told me I couldn't have her in the school. I tried to explain that getting a 100-pound dog to go somewhere she doesn't want to go was not an easy task, but he didn't want to hear it. So I brought her home and didn't come back. Not the teacher, but a student. One of the girls on my bus route was in a car accident which my best friend witnessed. I didn't see the accident myself, but I could see some of the aftermath as my best friend got on the bus and we continued to school. I spent the entire bus ride comforting my friend, and when we got to school we both went to the bathroom so she could clean her face, have a little cry, and then we went our separate ways to our forms. My friend was in a different form to I, but the girl who had been in the accident was in the same form. Homeroom, I guess. So when I walked in, the teacher tells me off a little before asking why I was late. I, being an innocent 12-year-old, tried to calmly explain what had happened, but the girl's friends started freaking out thinking the worst had happened. I tried to explain that I thought she was fine, but I didn't actually know, so it was hard to reassure anyone. My teacher was furious. She began screaming and yelling at me about telling horrific lies and wishing harm on my fellow classmate. She was so angry and loud that I also started crying, thinking I had indeed committed a truly horrible crime. There I was, stood at the front of the class being screamed at for telling the truth. My teacher is summoned out of the room while this is going on, so she harshly instructs me to just take my seat and keep quiet rather than spread more lies, and she would deal with me when she came back. She was gone for about 10 minutes, during which I was told off by my classmates for saying something so horrid about a fellow student. When my teacher finally returns, it is with the deputy headmistress. The DH calmly explains there was a small accident on my bus route that morning, that a girl was injured, but that she, the DH, had spoken with the mother and had been assured that the girl would make a full recovery thanks to the care she received in the hospital. The accident was actually very minor as she was only clipped. Some nasty bruises, a few cuts and a mild concussion. My teacher was then forced to apologize to me personally, as well as the class as a whole, for not believing me and at least trying to find out if what I said was true. I was also offered a chance to talk to the DH privately to discuss the accident and what I'd seen / how I felt about it, because I was considered a witness. My mother arrived an hour or so late to pick me up, and she took my best friend and I for ice cream. I later learned that she also took the school to task for my treatment, and my teacher was given a mandatory summer training course on how to speak to children about traumatizing events. I'm not a teacher, but this did happen to me. I'm in high school and I have to take public transportation to school every day. I have to be dropped off at the transit center, take a bus to my train stop, get on the train, then walk the half a mile the rest of the way to school. Important for later. That day I was already running a little late, so I got on a later bus than usual, but when we reach my stop there are multiple buses stopped in from of us, so we're nowhere near the platform to let people off. After about 10 minutes of being at a standstill, the bus driver tells us that there is a broken down bus in front of us and that we have to wait for someone to come out and fix it. We wait for about another 10 to 20 minutes before the bus driver announces that instead of waiting, that he's gonna just skip my stop and go to the next one. At this point I'm starting to panic because I had a big Spanish test that day that I couldn't miss, and I've missed a big chunk of my first period. He stops at the next stop and I get off, and I realize that I have a even bigger problem. My bus route is right in the middle of the freeway, so I can't just walk over to the other side of the bus stop in the middle of the freeway and get on the next bus. I end up having to take the nasty elevator. It was covered in weed, bus, and alcohol, down to street level, jaywalk into oncoming traffic, and get back on the next bus to get back to my stop. And because it's so late in the day now, my bus isn't coming as frequently, so I have to wait longer than usual, an extra 10 minutes or so, to get back. Once I do the same thing happens with by train, and I end up waiting another 20 or so minutes. At this point I just want to go home, but I know that I can't cause my parents would have killed me, and I didn't have a ride home anyway. So by now I've completely missed my first period and most of my second period that I had the big test for, and have to walk the rest of the way to my school in excruciating heat. I live in California and it's just late in the day that I get no protection. But to make it even worse, when I told the front desk what had just happened to me, they didn't believe it and said that I needed to be more responsible and gotten on a earlier bus like all of that was in my control, and gave me a unexcused tardy slip. I ended up missing my test and I reeked of weed. Every stop reeked of it, but especially that elevator and sweat. I was so done with everything and everyone by the time I got home. Backstory first. This was a few years back, the final day before spring break, high school, an 11th grader. I'm walking across the courtyard to a friend's classroom during lunch when I see a student who wasn't in my last class. My first thought is whatever, I don't have the will/energy to deal with a student who skipped the day before break. But then the student sees that I see him, he turns and runs. So of course I casually stroll after him to figure out what is going on. When I find him hiding in a hallway, he does his best to explain why he was not in class. The excuse: he had been at the local community college, where some high school students take college classes and get both high school and college credit. There was traffic, so he was late getting back to the high school. The entire time he is going through his excuse, he is stuttering, unusual for this student. He was a lead in multiple school plays and acting very nervous, as if he had done something wrong. The excuse seemed perfectly normal. The issue was that week the community college was on spring break. The colleges nearby intentionally stage their spring break with the public schools. I knew because one of my roommates worked at the community college. I texted her just to make sure. I had a student sent down to my room later that day. He doubles down onto his story saying that he wasn't actually in class at the college, but was meeting with a professor. I got the professor's name at the college's library. I'll let it go and text my friend. She confirms that the library was also closed for the break. So that afternoon I emailed the professor asking him about all of this. I got a response on Monday, and to my shock, it was true. My student had asked the professor for help with a project, so the professor had agreed to meet with him over their spring break, knowing that my student was trying to get the work done before his high school spring break. To make matters even better, the student didn't have a driver's license. His mom was the one driving him back and forth between the college and high school. Student had a solid reason for missing class on a day many students just skip school, but was so afraid of getting in trouble. Oh, I remember back in school as a pupil myself, we were usually taking the school bus, and it was the one that had a weird route that went zigzag across the town and collected all the other kids. Usually it went all without a hassle, but especially in winter we were always really late or right on time. Now this day, we had a German exam. 3H long, essay/poetry analysis, or whatever, something that took quite some time. Our bus was a double-decker and many towns in southern Germany have narrow streets and tight corners, so it's hard to navigate, but should be manageable. So anyway, we were sitting in the back row upstairs and suddenly we came to a halt while trying to take the corner to the right as the traffic got a bit stuck, and it made the corner even harder to take. Bus lady steered to the right and suddenly we heard this loud, almost explosive metallic scratching noise. As it turned out, she hit the corner of a house with the rear part of the upper bus. So what does the lady do? She continued to steer into the corner and proceeded to ram the corner through the bus to the point that the tip was already like 30 centimeters inside the bus and shattered all of the windows. The ecstatic girls that were sitting to the windows were screaming like pigs about to be slaughtered. This sheet, while in reality not all that dangerous, plays with your nerves nonetheless and is far from ideal right before her important exam. The bus driver lady herself was extremely nervous and just drove away for some reason and took a whack erratic route to some place that was not school. Fast forward almost one school lesson later, and we arrived in the classroom with no real time to explain our situation. The time was simply deducted from us, and we were left with much less time than the rest. We couldn't finish, went to the principal later, and had to retake the exam another day with full story, because we were obviously not at fault. So, I'm not a teacher, but this happened to me. It was an unusual day. My mom and dad were both on a morning shift in work, since like 4 or 5 in the morning, so they couldn't wake me up for school. But somehow my alarm woke me up, so I got ready and headed to the school, which was like 4 minutes of walk. So I wasn't going with any public transportation as bus or something. On the way to school I haven't seen anyone from our school, and that was suspicious, since a lot of guys were going the same way I always go. I arrived to school, and we should have had economics class on our route classroom, but nobody was there, so I went to office and asked if they didn't know where my class was. She told me they went upstairs to the ed class, so I was like, nice, we have substitute for economics today. I walked in, I took my seat, turned on PC, and I saw a time X55. I didn't pay attention to the hour, since I was thinking I wasn't late. After a few minutes my economics teacher walked in. He also was teaching economics in it. As soon as he entered the class he asked me, where have you been? And I was like, where should have been? I was at home. He looked at me, and he told to himself something like, I have to be idiot. Then I looked at the time again, and it was like 9:10. Our first class used to be 8 o'clock to 8:45, so I have had my class hour go. not a teacher, just a junior in high school, but I finally have a story for one of these. My English class is my first period on an 8-day. We run in a/B block schedule. By this point, I had made a habit of walking with one of my senior friends to my English class, as his history class was next to my classroom. So I had literally watched him enter his classroom before joining up with my classmates. We then started discussing the thing that we were supposed to read for homework when the bell rings, signaling the start of class, and the teacher isn't here. We thought that our teacher may have gotten into an accident or something, so we wait, but he's still not here even after a few minutes. So, one of my classmates texts his friend, who was in our English class, who texts him that our class takes place in the library for that day, which was something that happens sometimes. Then we are all like, wait, he didn't leave a note for us. Then we turn to the door and see a sign, written in thin pencil, saying 1A, go to library. So basically, we had been causing a disturbance for the past few minutes, considering classes were happening around us, and we were the only people in the hallway. I even said, oh my god, we are so fucking stupid, we are literal idiots over and over. The problem was, classes had started, and the library was in another building that was always locked to students, so you needed someone from the inside to open the door for you. Luckily, one of the art teachers in the building opened the door for us, and when he asked why we were all late, I told him, as I took his A/V class, we are idiots. The rest of class then proceeded as normally as it could have. I had a student whose appendix burst overnight before a project was due. Backstory: I always give a big speech about communication, especially when big projects are due. Basically, if you let me know beforehand you are struggling or are delayed, or whatever, I'm pretty flexible within reason. But if day of you say I didn't get it, or can I have more time, well then tough sheet. Another big thing is kids think that being absent means things aren't due. My assignments are usually digital, or have at least a large digital portion, maybe a poster to accompany something. So even if you stay homesick, you can still email me. And I make it very crystal clear that absence still is late, unless you take the simplest action imaginable and email me saying, Mr. Nobody, I'm sick today. Here's my assignment, or when can I turn it in? Pretty much anything acknowledging you don't want points deducted. Simple. And yet every year I would end up failing kids because of chronic late work, past the grading cycle, not one day late. So, there's this one kid, CC is brilliant but lazy. He's in a senior calculus class in 10th grade. He's notorious for cutting it close with assignments. I already was conditioning him for this major project because I knew he was at risk of dropping a letter grade if his project was late. On the due date, C doesn't show up. He's younger than the rest of the class, so nobody really knows him. Nobody knows where he is. No email. No communication. He made his choice. I write him off. A few days later C comes in. Fortunately he had his project, so I didn't have to deal with that too. I'm ready to read him the riot act when he's like, I'm sorry mister. My appendix burst and I was in a hospital bed all weekend. He even showed me his stitches. I didn't need the proof. He's trustworthy. All I could say was okay, that proves there is an exception to every rule. Sorry if there's any grammatical errors. In elementary school, 3rd grade I think, we were on our normal route to school. We had picked up a couple kids who were after me, and then we got to the stoplight where 2 different bus routes, one being mine, met. Our bus, number 66, and the other, number 7. Just keep in mind that our bus is practically overflowing with students as is, but bus 7 couldn't get through to the rest of their stops because one of the riders' house was on fire. We had to pick up everyone from the rest of the stops and sit like 4 to a seat pretty much. But that girl whose house was on fire calmly walked on our bus, said thank you to our bus driver for picking her up, walked to the back of the bus, and just started giggling with her friends. Everyone just had a what the fuck moment like, why is she so calm? Has it happened before? What's going on? What's happening? Our bus driver explained. We all calmed down, and by the time we got to school, homeroom, which was kind of just like 20 minutes to get ready for the day, was already over. Later, we learned that it was caused by a candle that had been left lit and fell over, if I remember correctly. I guess she wasn't allowed to stay there because her parents wanted her to be away from all the fumes from the fire, and so she came to school after. It's kinda funny that no one cared after like 2 days. Everything just went back to normal. Elementary school, when we all had the attention span of an ant. Obligatory, not the teacher, but the student comment. But my senior year of high school I worked before school every morning at a small coffee shop. For some strange reason they trusted 17-year-old me to open up this coffee shop every morning by myself. One of the managers, a really lazy and terrible employee, was supposed to come relieve me of my shift so I could get to school. However, he was often very late, which made me very late to school. My stepmom was driving me to school as I did not have my license at the time, but got fed up with me making her late for work all the time. So my best friend, who was also 17 and in the same morning class as me, would pick me up. So one morning, we had a large order called in for scones. Now, I was also the only baker at this coffee shop. Again, not sure why they hefted all that responsibility on a high schooler, so this order was entirely my responsibility. I asked the manager to come a bit early that morning so I could finish up the scones rather than dealing with customers non-stop, as I ordinarily had to answer the drive-through window and the counter by myself while trying to get all the baked goods in the case for the day. He said he would be there early, but the day came, and as is no surprise he was late. We had been busy with customers all morning, which threw off my ability to finish the scone order. Finally, I did, and my best friend and I sped to school. We sprinted into our first classroom, which was choir class, very late. The choir director just glared at us. And my dear best friend, who is much more outspoken than me, shouted dancer 15 was making scones. The director rolled his eyes, clearly not believing us, as he knew we were best friends, known to get up to crazy antics, and had walked in with coffers. But then, I walked up to him, with flour in my hair, and dropped a small box of scones in front of him. He then just started laughing, shook his head, and marked us both down on the attendance, then told us to go sit down. Not a teacher, but actually was the excuse point in college. My roommate and I lived in a fairly decent apartment not too far off campus at the time. I was working at a hospital and had to be there at 6 AM, which has always been closer to my natural bedtime than wake up time. And so I was always a complete zombie heading into work and went almost entirely on autopilot. So I have a normal day at work and heading home, get to my apartment door, and again mostly just by muscle memory unlock one deadbolt, which functions perfectly normally. And then as I'm unlocking the other deadbolt, it unlocks perfectly normally too, and in an instant I realized that that part was a big problem. C. A day or two before then, the knob to the deadbolt broke off on the inside of the apartment. There was no way to lock or unlock it in there. The bigger problem was that my roommate had a huge final that day and was locked inside for the day. By the time he was leaving to head to take the test, I guess he figured it was too late to try and call me or the building management to come and unlock it. So he emails the professor explaining the situation while freaking out and, I assume, cursing my name. I walk into him doing some leisurely reading on the couch, and as I walk in he shoots up and just kind of stared at me. He'd long since cooled off, mostly, and I imagine that the look on my face communicated clearly that I knew I messed up and felt bad. Mostly he was just stressed, cause he hadn't heard back from the professor yet. I offered to head right to campus to talk to the professor myself. Anything I could do. I'm feeling pretty dickish right then, obviously, even though it was an honest mistake. As we're having this discussion, he walks to his computer to check his email, and there's the email back from his professor. The entire thing said, in essence, that is way too stupid of an excuse for you to have made it up. You can take the final later. I posted about this in another comment thread, but here's my story. I was a student, freshman at the time. I lived on campus in a dormitory. One day, I had to drop by my room to pick up something or another that I needed for my BO 102 lecture. I get into my room, get my stuff, and go to book it to my next class. As I go to open the door, the faking door knob pops off in my hand. I stand there for a few seconds just processing it, and I couldn't help but laugh. I couldn't get it back on, so I could open the door. I didn't have a roommate. She moved out, and everyone I could call, including the rap, was in class. I called the rap because who else am I gonna call, and she got maintenance to me point. So maintenance lets me out of my room, and obviously they want to put my door knob back on. I'm over 15 minutes late at this point, waiting on maintenance plus a 3-story walk up, and I pretty much blatantly tell the guy, look, my professor is not going to believe me if I tell her that the door knob fell off, unless I bring this with me. Can you come back after my last class? He laughed and agreed, and I booked it to class on my bike, door knob tucked into the side pocket on my backpack point. My professor lost her mind. She found it hilarious and told me that was the best excuse she had ever seen a student bring in. I even made a joke of it by telling her that she could have the door knob if I didn't need it so badly. At the end of the semester I bought a door knob from the local hardware store and gave it to her. I think she keeps it on her desk in her office. I did used to be a teacher, but this story was from when I was a student. 14 years old. I got up one morning, got ready for school. Everything was normal until my sister came downstairs and announced that she had taken every pill she could find and wanted to die. After a moment of shocked silence, Mom hustled both of us out the door and drove like a madwoman to the hospital. She ordered me to stay in the car, took my sister inside, and then came out 20 minutes later. She was completely silent when she got in the car and started driving. I was terrified. I finally got up the nerve to ask about my sister, and Mom replied in an oddly calm voice, she's going to be fine. They're pumping her stomach and she'll be staying at the hospital for a while. Then she stopped the car and I realized she was parked in front of my school. Try to have a good day, honey, she called as I got out and watched her drive away. When I got to class and was questioned about my lateness, sister attempted suicide got me a collective gasp and a trip to the office to call my parents. Mom was in shock and had driven me to school on autopilot. She apologized profusely when she picked me up an hour later. It was not my sister's last attempted suicide, but she never succeeded, and she's managing her depression and anxiety much better, thank goodness. Not a teacher but a student. When I was in high school I had gotten a stomach bug that decided to kick into full gear around third period. I started getting bubble guts and knew something was going to happen. At lunch I thought I just needed to eat something and I would be okay. Dead faking. Wrong. I run to the bathroom and puke up everything I just ate. On one of my last dry heaves I sheet my pants. I felt it come and I couldn't do anything about it. The lunch bell ran for next period, and I was in a world of hurt. I took off my pants and grabbed a pair of gym shorts out of my bag and put them on. I cleaned up the best I could and dumped a small trash can out and threw my soiled boxes and pants in the bag, threw it in my book bag, and I went to my next class. That was already 15 minutes in. When I rolled in looking like hot death and rocking gym short, my teacher, trying to make an example of me, told the class that because I was late I wouldn't be able to take the quiz that was passed out at the beginning of class, and that this is why you shouldn't be late. Something in my just snapped and I pulled out the bag full of my sheet clothes and threw it on my desk yelling, I just sheet my pants, fuck your quiz. Then proceeded to throw up all over the floor and sheet my gym shorts. It was one hell of a day in government class. She let me make up the quiz when I came back to school. SN. My dad picked me up and gave me so much shit thinking I was faking it until I puked all over the side of his car going 65 on the highway. He bought me ginger ale and crackers and took care of me as an apology. Also, the student moved to the NW. I'd never heard of freezing rain before. Where I grew up that's called snow. Anyways, woke up late and was driving 60 miles per hour assuming roads were clear, wondering why traffic was light and people were driving so slow. Rolled my 91 Ford Ranger 3 times. Tree stopped the 4th roll. Somehow the driver's side formed a cocoon around me. Climbed out of the wreckage, laying with driver's door in the dirt. Found my backpack with my brand new $150 T86 graphing calculator under the rear driver's wheel. In my shocked state I started freaking out about the calculator and frantically pulling on the backpack. About 2 minutes pass and another driver slows down and asks, hey, everyone okay? Did that happen last night? I said no, it happened like 2 minutes ago, but I'm late for school, can you give me a ride? He was incredulous, and it took me a few minutes to convince him I was okay. I was the driver of the vehicle, and indeed I just needed a ride to school. He reluctantly drove me to school, where I arrived to find school was actually cancelled. So I called my parents to come get me, explaining the situation, and they were like, okay, yeah sure, you totaled your truck, whatever, we're finishing breakfast, we'll pick you up in a bit, no big deal. When my mom saw the truck on the way to get me, she freaked out, took me to the hospital, got checked, and I was fine. Pretty sore the next day. Good news was my T86 survived. Truck did not. HWY6 between Banks and TV Highway Oregonians. On the straight stretch before the hill/pond. I know what freezing rain is now too. Obligatory, not a teacher, but when I was in community college, there was a path I had to take between classes very specifically, because I'm allergic to tobacco smoke, and of course the only other way into the building I needed was crowded with students smoking between classes. So I found an alternate route that involved a little area that was kind of a go-between for the building I was in previously and the one I needed to be in for the next class. The doors were always propped open, but for some reason on the day I was rushing, because my previous class had gotten out late, they were closed. No big deal. I open it and run in, right before slamming into the door on the other side. Turns out, the reason they were always propped open was because they locked from the outside for whatever reason, and of course, not knowing this, the door I came from had already closed and locked. So I'm trapped in the small square room in a panic, because there's no ventilation save for the cracks under the doors and a hole in the wall that I assume a big bolt used to be in, is my best guess anyway, and it's literally 110 F outside. You'd think someone would come along and try to use the same shortcut, and they did, but it was about half an hour later when I'm sweating so bad that I've taken off almost everything I could, and before I could even say a word they'd let the door close. They were very heavy and were propped open with plastic door stops usually. So then there were two. After another 15 or so minutes, we posted up at both doors to grab it when someone else opened it, but that took another half hour or so, both of us hardly dressed, because it was so hot. Needless to say, we got out, and after making decent again, I sweated my way into the last few minutes of class. It was a class with lab right after, so it was extra long, and the teacher asked why I even bothered showing up. I handed her the third of 4 major papers that was due that day, and left again without a word, because I needed water, and lots of it. I did manage to explain the next class, and she laughed, and said that everyone knew that go-between was always locked if it wasn't open, and that I should always check and make sure. To her credit, I will never not check doors multiple times before letting them close behind me, regardless of weather or urgency. Obligatory. I was a student, and also I'm late. In college I registered for 2 classes with 15 minutes in between, on 2 different campuses about 15 minutes apart without traffic. I cleared it with the second class prof on the first day, showed him my schedule, and asked him if it'd be okay if I was regularly about 5 minutes late due to the first class being at the other campus, otherwise I would switch courses. He said yes, sure, that's fine, but forgot and would regularly get mad at me for always showing up 5 minutes late. I reminded him a couple times, and he'd be like, oh yes right okay, but would forget again after a few classes, and make some shirty comment at me walking in late, or give me the stank eye. Another time I drove home for the weekend, about 2.5 hours away, and headed back to school at like 5 or 6 am, which shoulda given me a couple hours back on campus before my first class. One of my tires blew, and completely shredded about 3/4 of the way there. Didn't have a spare, had to wait 1.5 hours on the side of the interstate till AAA got to me, and saved my button car. This was before smartphones. I did have a regular brick cell phone though. Couldn't find my prof's office, but did find his email, so I called my boyfriend and asked him to email my prof explaining what happened and that I was currently waiting for AAA, but I'd be at class if I could make it back in time. I think this was about an hour before class started at this point. In a ho, I finally made it to class with about 15 minutes left. Prof was a real cool dude and was just like, "Ah, you made it. Got your email. Great. and to the rest of the class questioning looks, he goes AAA tire blue and continued on lecturing.